All right, we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We are picking up in verse 34. That is the closing verse of a section that began with verse 29, in which he is kind of bringing everything from the first part of this chapter all together to be able to note that he's provided the evidence, and that's interesting. He chose first to provide the specific evidence. He accounts for it at the beginning in verses 1 through 4, and showing that this is what it's really about in the gospel, and that the resurrection is a key component of the gospel, presents then the evidence of those as witnesses of Christ's resurrection, and then making the argument following upon that in the beginning of verse 12, that it is essential to have and recognize the resurrection of Christ and its implications, not just then for him, but its meaning for our resurrection. So that in verse 20, he then demonstrates that this is for everyone, and that is looking into the day that when this will all take place, far in the future, whenever, as far as we're thinking, we don't know when. It could be tomorrow, it could be tonight. But it's off there, and it's not the immediate, that you can't assume that as it was with Christ. Christ was raised the third day. It's not a guarantee you're going to be raised the third day. The guarantee is you will be raised the last day. And so he discusses that and closes that argument off by showing what God will do and how all of this ultimately is put together because of Christ. So then in verse 29, he begins to point out and kind of indicate the problem by posing some questions and some assumptions about why they would assume this issue, by talking about your assumption, this idea that some of you are accepting that there's no resurrection, doesn't make sense, not only with what the gospel, the implications of the gospel we've just been discussing, but now that we've gotten that out of the way, it doesn't make sense as to what people's behavior are religiously outside of us. That's verse 29. And then he goes through, beginning in verse 30, and talks about himself and others who teach, probably the apostles more specifically, but talk about why would it make any sense for us to put our lives in jeopardy if we die, there's no reward. Why would that make any sense? Why would we be willing to do that? So the whole idea is, going through, as we looked at through verse 32, if that's as far as it gets you, and it's only the benefit in life, then the only thing that makes sense is try to preserve your life here as best you can, no matter what, because that's the only time you get any benefit. So that doesn't make sense. So he then comes down to verse 33, and the more important part, very specifically, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. And we pointed out how we generally use that, kind of as a warning for kids, and just don't hang out with the wrong crowd. But that very specifically in this context, he's talking about you've been hanging around people and being influenced by their ideas doctrinally. And that you need to be aware that the company you keep, often their ideas become your ideas, and that's not a good thing if you are not very much aware of what's going on with them and where they fall, what they're thinking, that they can have an influence on you and therefore create a problem for you spiritually. Evil company, interesting kind of way in which that's worded about the nature of the evil. It's just something that's bad. It's going to corrupt now, so that it takes something that is good and introduce some things that are negative, and that ends up ruining it. Okay, so think about this a little bit. You don't have to have and come up and reject everything in Scripture to ruin your hope of heaven. You don't have to go in and reject everything. All it takes is rejecting certain things, and that'll ruin it enough. And that's really what he's pointing about, the nature of what that corruption is. And it corrupts, in this case, though, good, kind habits, practices, so that specifically, all that they've talked about before, there are also some problems that if you're not looking into eternity, think about how that changes your understanding of what you are to do, what your responsibilities are. There's a reason why he quotes from the Epicureans, essentially, is it's going to change. One, we often don't make this connection, but it's just doctrine affects behavior. What you believe is going to affect how you behave. And that can be good or bad. Hopefully, when you understand and understand things correctly about everything God's done for you, what he's expecting of you, it is designed to provoke changes in how you live. But if you accept the idea that when you die, there's nothing, that will change how you behave. Because it just took away hope. It took away all sorts of good motivations. It took away the power of what was accomplished. It lowers everything that God did for you. And in the end, it turns Christianity into this quaint kind of subset of religion. Nice to believe, what a good story. We'll do our best to live a better life now, and I can, and that's it. And that's where a lot of people end up. And it's because of these big picture compromises that they stopped really believing in the core things. And it affects how you think, and therefore it affects how you look at life, and it affects your behavior. That's why it was a serious business. Think about how they were accepting Jesus' resurrection, but the real problem, they weren't accepting their own. That's a serious issue. And that's why he tells them, you're being deceived, you're with the wrong crowd, and now verse 35, you need to wake up. Notice what he says. Awake to righteousness and do not sin. For some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. Now, once again now, based upon what we just got through discussing, notice what he connects here. He just connected this failure to understand to sin, and tying it then back to their ignorance, not having the knowledge of God. So, what was the sin they were committing? He says, and do not sin. He needs them to stop sinning. You need to wake to righteousness. We'll talk about that in a minute. And do not sin. You realize they were essentially saying, they were rejecting what God had said. They were rejecting part of the gospel. And that's wrong. It's deadly. That's part of his point. It has implications about what you would do, again, with your behavior, your habits. Do not sin. This is taking you the wrong direction. Here's what it's going to take to go the right direction. You're going to have to wake up, number one, to righteousness. Okay? And that is, we're going to talk about what righteousness is in a moment. And then apply the next step and do not sin. Go a different direction what these people are taking you, with the direction of what their influence is. So you've got to be willing to reject the negative influence in order to accept the proper influence. But that means you've got to be able to tell the difference. People, it's not that hard for me to get an agreement on, oh, you need to stay away from bad influences. Yeah. You need to have the right kind of influences in your life. Everyone goes, yeah. And you've got to figure out which one is which. And everyone goes, stop it. What good is it to blather on about principles if you cannot apply them? Exactly how have you been helped if you can't tell the difference? All you do is interpret any influence you have as being a good influence. any influence you don't like as being a bad influence, and you're comfortable. But there are standards for those things, and we have to consider the standards of it, okay? If we're not going to sin. So he says, awake to righteousness. Now, technically it reads, wake up righteously. The waking up is saying something about how he's interpreting their current state. That they are asleep righteously. Now, to understand what that term of righteousness and righteously means, it's a big idea in some ways. But in order to, it covers essentially doing the right thing. Okay, if I put a big biblical umbrella about it, it covers righteousness generally, all that God has done to make us right with Him, including telling us what to do, and therefore our participation also. All that's righteousness. It's that place where God's reaching out, including giving us our instructions to do, it meets with our reaction to Him when it's proper. And so this is your opportunity to be right with God. So if you need to wake up righteously, is that here is God giving you opportunity to learn and to grow, to be close to Him. And you're sleeping through it. You know, I don't know, it depends on what your favorite thing, the biggest event you can imagine would be. That would be, this is what I want to do. For some of us, that'd be like say our favorite sports team going and that either the Super Bowl or the clinching game of a series. And you're a big fan, a huge fan. How many of you, being a huge fan, are going to sleep through that game? But that's kind of what he is saying they were doing. They were asleep on the possibilities that God had put before them because of the resurrection. Well, complacency would indicate that they had an understanding and they didn't care about the understanding, but because they had essentially taken it off the table, there was nothing to care about. So it's a little bit different. It shows you that connection between a doctrine, once it's corrupted, about it, just you move it over, and now the care is not going to be, the attention's not going to be the same. If I tell you that you are saved and going to heaven no matter what, will that affect the attention you give to your own life and righteousness? We've got evidence of that around us, right? Okay. So these doctrine matters, it affects behavior, they're connected. And to understand then, here's what God's giving you, and it's to wake up to what is before you and to really embrace it and to stay alert to it. That's the word here again, has that kind of root idea, is to like, He's kind of coming on, and spiritually speaking, he's coming with his letter in, and he's shaking them awake. He's pouring cold water on them and saying, get up. Don't know what someone's done to make you think that you just go ahead and ignore all this, but you need to get over that. Awake to righteousness and do not sin. If you don't understand what's at stake, then you will not take the appropriate action. this whole idea is completely being contrasted with the whole idea of let us eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. This is the other side. Awake to righteousness and do not sin. You see how those work together? For some do not have a knowledge of God. Is this knowledge about God himself or about what God knows? Yes? I think that's the correct answer. Yes. You see, when you look into and you open up your Bible, you should realize that you are entering a world, if you will. God is explaining this world, your life, you, and himself to you. He is talking about, and he's explaining why he made us, how he values us, what we need to do if we value us, what we will do when we value him and what he has done for us. And then he makes promises based upon all the evidence he's laid out of what he is still willing to do for us. These are things that can count as knowledge, promise. Even though it's in the future, this is God who's doing it. And that's what the resurrection is why it was hard for them. Don't have a knowledge of God. Partly what he's transitioning to is their lack of knowledge of God, too, in a very personal way, is creating a situation of where they didn't appreciate what God could do. Now, when you immediately are going to, the next verse is going to explain this a little bit more of why he is getting there as a transition. Because he's going to be explaining the ideas. Well, that's impossible. You've got to understand the kind of objections here. That's impossible. And to that Jesus says, with God, nothing's impossible. That's why he says, I speak this to your shame. Because what they were doing, what had gotten them to this point, part of it was bringing God down to their own level. To see God in what he said and evaluating God based upon the previous understanding of what a God could do if you're a pagan. A previous hope if you're a Jew. So we end up pulling God down so that he fits more within my own framework. When in actuality, Scripture is written for you to be able to let go of just the limitations of a worldly framework to realize there's something far greater because there is someone far greater. But that's hard to grasp. It's hard to just understand. You can walk through it even logically about why God must exist. I don't even think that's the part's that hard, logically. But then to understand how God exists because he must, and what he must be like because of what is. And then to understand what that interaction, what our limitations are, and how we're trying to deal with that, that's the problem. And it's what was contemplated by David in Psalm 8. What is man that you are mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you visit him? How do we reconcile the bigness of God with the smallness of man and God giving us so much attention? That's part of the challenge. And it requires us to be able to think. So it says, they had chosen to make God smaller so that it fit their paradigm, instead of reaching out and seeing how big God is to change them in their own personal paradigm of what they should be. I speak to this James. I am disappointed in you. That's embarrassing that you do this. That's what he's telling them. That's embarrassing. Now, with all of that is the emotional kind of context for this. He is now going to begin beginning with objections, but in a much longer section that will take up pretty much the remainder of this chapter, to deal with where the misunderstanding of why there were objections to the idea of resurrection. Okay? That's what he's going to be addressing now. So let's now move in and look at verse 35 and begin this process. You see, but someone will say, it's kind of a nice way to indicate, probably this is where someone is coming from. These are the objections you've heard. But someone will say, how were the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? So that's now we're going to transition to, here's where the big objection is that created the problem in the first place, to say, no, that can't happen. Now, imagine with me, and we don't have anything specifically on it, but you think there might have been a Sadducee Jew that could have been part of this? Remember, you go back to chapter 1, the idea of the resurrection was kind of hard for some of them, both Jews and Greeks. The Jews, that was a big issue for a Sadducee because they didn't believe in it at all. The Pharisees had an idea of the resurrection, but it itself was a little flawed. And then you come back and you go over and you think about what the pagans believed. Well, some of them didn't even believe in a resurrection or in afterlife, just kind of depended. Iffy. So that you have all of those there when you come in and say, that wasn't part of how they kept. We accept this because for us, culturally, this was so dominant. It was not at all, dominant before. It was a very small minority of people in the Roman Empire or the world that believed there would be a resurrection, and that was even kind of a little bit off. That's what you were working with when Christianity comes on the scene, so to appreciate why this could have been a problem for them.
So those who are Jews or had that background and knew the Old Testament scriptures and what had happened when Jesus was on the earth, is it that they thought that no one could be raised not to die again, or did they not even believe in those?
No, not to die again, and we were talking about that earlier, Paco and I were, is that they had the evidence previously, Elisha, for example, and someone had been raised, but that person died again. They weren't still around during the first century, and the same thing was true later. So it was like you got a reprieve on death, but death eventually gets you. And the whole point of resurrection is because of Jesus and his resurrection, not to die again, is what's promised is a resurrection for you not to die again. And so that was very hard for anybody to kind of get into and think about it in an acceptable way. So the natural question, okay, how? Now, let me start by saying that to some degree is a legitimate question. You can look at it as a question of curiosity. How? That he's going to explain a little bit. But sometimes we ask how questions mainly to create doubt. How are the dead raised up? You can't tell me that. You're just telling me that the dead are raised up, and we just accept it. But then what are you going to go from there? And then the second part, which he's going to get to, and you see this play out, how are the dead raised up, and then in what body do they come? That's how he's going to divide the second half of this chapter. Greg?
I was just going to say, a lot of times, if you disagree with something conceptually, then it's like
Yes.
Even, because you're like, you're gonna start trying to poke holes in it because you don't really understand it.
Okay, no, that is correct. His point is about that if you just kind of disagree conceptually, philosophically with it, now you may start making attacks against it. This is what I'll give two examples. This is why you end up with people attacking, say, with evolution. Evolutionists have to attack any idea of a short time of existence. That they can't have that because it destroys their model. For example, I was on my my device of addiction yesterday, and it came up in this little video about, it's one of those did you know, which I always love these little short videos that everyone's do, did you know? Most of them, you need to understand, like half of them, that person didn't know either. Okay. Well, in this case, you did you know that, and it was that you end up with it, that it rained for a period, and I think they had like 2 million years. And it created all this havoc with storms and all of this coming up. I'm like, well, you're getting closer. I don't think I'm going to give you credit for being a genius for saying that. Because Genesis 6 through 9 is in the Bible. Is that, all they do is you end up having all these kind of evidence they do, and then they insert the time model. Which is kind of interesting because all the evidence actually starts lining up exactly with what you find in Scripture, but then they throw in a model that interprets it in regard to this had to have happened over all this time, even when there's evidence that actually, no, that would be impossible. Okay. So that's kind of but you attack the mode. You go into those kind of things. One of my favorites is when people, when we have a flat earth kind of idea, trying to put it to the test and don't realize that they're disproving their own model. But that kind of thing going, that's the problem, okay? So the questions are, how are the dead raised up? I want to know how, you may want, and with what body do they come? These are objections. You have to see that what they're doing is, these are objections that have been raised, and that Paul is going to answer those so that there's no longer can be an objection to them as far as the reasons. So he dealt with it in principle the first half of the chapter. Then you have this interlude about, I'm really disappointed in you people for doubting, the resurrection of Christ, the power of the gospel on this. So now let me go into detail so I can give you the explanation that you think you need to be able to accept this, okay? Which helps us out. So then, and we're just going to, this is kind of the introduction to the how he's doing this now, verse 36. Foolish one. Foolish one. What you sow is not made alive unless it dies. That's an interesting way to begin, but we have to think about what's he actually wanting to get across by this. Okay? What is the comparison that he is creating here by this statement? The nature of a crop. Yeah, and that's what he's going to use that for this first illustration. He's going to be using, and this is key, he's going to be illustrating this through the natural universe. So things that you can see around you, he's trying to get to a couple of core principles. The first one is that when you sow something, if you're going to get the crop, the seed has to die. That's when you look at what he's laying out here, your body is a seed. That's how he's treating it in this illustration, as we're going to see in a moment. It has to die, give it up, and be planted for then it to have the life that follows, which is, and again, he's pointing out, he's implying something down the line, very different far greater. But this has to happen. So he just wants to point out, first thing is the necessity of this going on. Okay, just accept the process. You accept the process that you're going to take a seed and you're going to have to put it in the ground and give up that seed if you're going to get a crop. Right? That's something you have to accept. You've got to take these, and you can't do anything. You've got to put them in the ground if you're going to get the crop in the end. Okay, it's got to die. Okay, in his illustration, give up its life, its existence, in order to get this other. Now, verse 37. And what you sow, you do not sow that body that shall be, but mere grain. Perhaps wheat or some other grain. Okay. This is now we are to the core part of the argument, which is that you are thinking about resurrection and body. You are thinking about this as just kind of being a redo. It says, you're assuming that we put this in the ground and you get this back. He says there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. So you don't sow the body that shall be. Okay, you don't take, ultimately the whole idea of what comes up with the grain that's very different. That's not what you put in the ground. Just the little tiny seed. So now think about what he is already trying to get you to understand. As about that this body is just a tiny kind of grain, piece of grain that you're going to plant to get something ultimately far better. It says, and basically he's saying, pick your grain, it doesn't matter. He says, it doesn't have to be wheat. I'll give you wheat, doesn't have to be, pick. The same principle applies. Is that you've got some small little thing that you are putting out there that it's just small, seems kind of irrelevant, and then produces something far greater. That's what he's trying to get them to see. So in verse 38 he says, but God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. Okay. So he gives it a body. Now, the thing is, have you ever thought about what actually makes something a body? Within this context, he says he gives it a body. That seed, okay, that has a body sense, okay, to it, gives to it as he pleases. So every seed gets its own body. Okay, so all these different kind of seeds and what they would be, each one has its own, okay, and it is going to produce. You put it into the ground, and these are different. Now this is, we're not going to have time to go into it all, but that's kind of the key he's getting to here, is that they're all different according to God's design, okay. But I want to stop and ask you, what exactly makes something, based upon this illustration, when we talk about a body, what do we mean? Well, that's not going to hold up if we go through the rest of the chapter. It's a good answer for on the earth, but it's not going to hold up later on because it's something different. Okay, I heard two things. Okay, you got a resurrection body, but that doesn't tell us what it is. What makes it a body? It's a resurrection body. It's still a body, so what's a body? But then we're talking about a seed. So a body is something that is beyond. You're already thinking ahead to you. Well, but a spirit is what we put with the body. It's a container for the spirit. Observable, can count on you, David. An observable manifestation of an individual or thing, and especially in regards to expression of that that being's, the nature of that being. What? An instance. But this is actually important when you think about what body means, because when we say body, we tend to immediately think physical, but then he's going to be talking about it's a spiritual body, which means it's not a physical body. Well, so now in order to understand the difference between those two, you have to know what a body is first. Because we always interpret a body based upon the physical, but there's a body that's not the physical. And he's going to spend some time talking about the differences that are going to exist because of the nature of how God made something. Okay? Greg?
I didn't really, when I read this passage, I never really thought about that, just the distinction between the bodies. But having distinct bodies, like you pointed out, each his own, I kind of think, I don't know, in the Greco-Roman world, I don't think there was those more Eastern religions, when you die, you just kind of get reintegrated into the collective.
Yeah.
And that's whole, like, there's no.
Okay, right. There's a body is something that is distinctive, that is individual, that is a container for your essence, that is the means where you then express that essence. I know that I would not do that to you if I didn't have to. No, I can't. To appreciate this a little bit, you have to realize that when you die, the spirit leaves the body, James chapter 2. Okay? So the spirit leaves the body. The spirit then is in the Hadean realm. But in the nature of spirit that is limited spirit, okay, and I'm going to make that distinction, there must be some means, some mode through which to find expression. And the body provides that. You don't have that after death. It's separated. That's actually one of the keys of the point of the resurrection, is the reuniting of spirit with body, which means that you will have a means of expression. Now it's going to change. We're going to get to that. That's the important part. The first part is resurrection. But sometimes what we do is we then stop there. We end up just with this, but that has all sorts of problems with it, okay, in terms of mode of expression, because which version of your body is going to be raised? Okay? Y'all are hoping that there's going to be like an A, B, C, D choice available to you, right? Yeah. How about this year? A new body. Yeah, okay, yes, but the new body is based upon the old body. So you're going to be raised. That body goes in, whatever those, we go back to the molecules of, that will be raised, and it's just not going to stay that way. Jesus was literally raised from the dead. Spirit, he went into the Hadean realm. Okay? He died, he was good shape, Hadean realm, but he was reunited with that body. That body is raised. Now, one of the things I like to kind of point out, and though it takes a little bit more, I'll do the short version, is that he interacted based upon that body, a raised body. Remember, got imprint of the nails, right? Side, he told Thomas. John was there, but later on in 1 John 3, John is going to anticipate and have them anticipate seeing Christ, because we will see him as he is. And this is someone that saw him throughout that period of time following the resurrection in a resurrected body, and then he was taken up. Okay?
John also saw him in his glorified
Yes, but we have to talk about what that means some other time. Because that goes back to a discussion we had based upon verses 24 and through 28 about what that would mean. Now, when you look at this, you've got the idea of now the seed, okay, your body, the physical body, being planted in the ground. That's why he chose that as an illustration. Being planted in the ground, some manner, and then with the idea, and this is kind of the nice nature of such a beautiful illustration. The whole point of putting a seed in the ground for a farmer is expecting it to come back out, isn't it? Do you see how that actually, it's subtle, but it's really, really clever. I know it's the Holy Spirit by inspiration too, but that's a beautiful illustration. You put a seed in with the full expectation. You just imagine your little elementary class people. When you put that little bean seed in your cup, do they still do the styrofoam cups, or are those illegal? And you put it with the soil in there. You do that, and the whole idea is to get them to watch with great expectation of when that's going to come back out. That's kind of the illustration he's got. We will pick that up next week.